I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Dan Lorenc worked at Google from 2012 to 2021, began contributing to open source projects in the Kubernetes community in 2016, and along the way developed the tooling that would become the Sigstore project, which helps to verify the provenance of open source code packages. Sigstore is now governed by the OpenSSF, where Dan is a member of the Technical Advisory Council. He is also co-founder and CEO of Chainguard, a software supply chain security startup. Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Beth.
So a lot of people point to software supply chain security and open source dependencies, as the industry saw with Log4Shell, as a key area of risk associated with open source's tragedy of the commons. Can you talk about how you've seen that unfold in this space?
Yeah, it's a common trope that gets brought out every time there's a vulnerability in a major piece of open source software. I do agree that there's a lot of risk in open source software, but I think I come at it from a different angle from everyone else.
Okay.
The tragedy of the commons thing gets brought up all the time, and I think that's about as far off as you can possibly get from what's actually happening.
Okay.
The tragedy of the commons, if you read what that actually refers to, it refers to a situation where there's like a shared park in between a bunch of houses and everyone uses it, but no one's incentivized to fix it all up so that the park gets worn down and everything. Mm-hmm. It's an easy analogy to make because you see open source as something that everyone depends on, but nobody's incentivized to maintain it. But it's sort of the opposite because using open source doesn't deteriorate it in the same way a park does. You're not wearing into the ground. You're not leaving trash around. Using open source, it's software. Anyone can use it. It doesn't actually deteriorate it in any way when people use it. In fact, in many ways, it strengthens it. The more folks using something, the more attention it gets, the more eyeballs it gets. It's true that not everyone that uses something contributes to it, but something with thousands of users typically has more contributors than something with one or two users. So there is risk associated with it. There's risk associated with all software. The more software you use, the more bugs there are in that software, the more likely one of those is to introduce a security risk. But I completely disagree with the framing around tragedy of the commons. By simply downloading something and running it, you're not deteriorating it. You're not causing the value to diminish. In fact, the more users, the stronger it is because those users do help strengthen it in other ways, just not directly.
Okay. But there is some difficulty occurring with open source maintenance, right? I mean, everybody points to that XKCD comic of, the world on a pin. How would you characterize that problem?
Yeah, there's a couple problems. One is just all software needs maintenance. That applies to both open source software, that applies to closed source software. In fact, what we've seen though is the track record for maintenance in open source software is much, much better than for closed source software. The problem is just that open source is eating the world. I hate that one too, but I have to say it again.
Right.
And so there's just more open source in use today. And so by virtue of that, we see more security issues there. But the main point of open source is that you have the source code. You can fix it yourself if you need to. That's a much better position to be in than closed source, even if not everyone is positioned enough to do that. Open source and the internet have a way of routing around damage. So when something like this happens, we do have options. What we saw with Log4Shell, though, was a great team of maintainers. Yeah, they weren't paid, they weren't professional, but they were able to get fixes out within a matter of days. Compare that to the breaches and stuff like Microsoft software or other closed source vendors where it takes months and months to get fixes out. In open source, even if those maintainers hadn't been able to get a fix out, someone else would have been able to step in a few days later and get that fix released.
But there are still things like the vulnerability database that you posted about recently that are maintained kind of as a public good or not maintained, as the case may be, where, as you say, people aren't incentivized to maintain them. And a few years ago, you and I talked at a conference about the idea of open source libraries that are widely used but underfunded or not funded at all, and the similarities with events like the housing bubble in 2007 and 2008. I mean, do you think we're in an open source maintenance bubble right now?
The one unique risk I do see with open source is that it's gotten so used and everyone is using the same stuff, which is great from some perspective, right? If everyone is using the same things, it makes it easier to fix, but it does introduce concentration risk. And I think that's where folks like the government are stepping in now to figure out how they can help. A vulnerability in a piece of open source software that's only used by 10 or 100 people isn't a big deal. But if there's a certain library out there that's used by literally everyone, and there's a vulnerability in that, it shifts from being something that the market can self-regulate to something that does pose a national security risk.
Right.
And I think that's where it kind of blurs the lines and where government regulation and government intervention might be needed. Not because of the risk of an individual maintainer maintaining one project, but because of the downstream effects of what were to happen if something like that does have a vulnerability and the maintainers can't fix it.
Right.
It's less about the quality of that individual piece of software and more how we've gone and built this whole industry on top of something like that. It's not that person's fault or the fault of that project.
Sure.
They just put it on the internet. They never asked for anyone to use it, but it does still have national security or industry-wide implications now.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do we do about that? Where do we go from here? How can the industry or government or society improve that picture?
That's where the housing bubble analogy sort of came in. It's less around like a bubble in maintenance and things getting abandoned and more the too big to fail analogy, where some of these things have crossed that boundary where we simply can't let them fail.
Yeah.
The hard part, though, is this is a freedom of speech issue, too. People put code on the internet. You can't stop them from doing that. And you can't tell them how to do their job. So I think where the government is pushing now is to reframe the consumption side of it. Companies aren't going to be allowed to continue relying on all of this stuff that comes with no warranties, right? If you read any open source license, the most important part of that from a maintainer's perspective is that it's provided as is with no warranties.
Right.
If you use that in a way that it was not designed for, or use that in a way that's unsafe, that's your fault, not the maintainer's fault. And that's where the responsibility needs to come in. It's also the only way the government can really enforce this stuff. They can't go tell people what you can and can't put on the internet, and they can't go tell people how they have to maintain open source stuff when there's no contractual relationship at all. You can't go say, do this or otherwise we'll stop paying you. That doesn't work when they're not paying you to begin with. And so you see a lot of these exceptions in March 11th. CISA in the US government put out their requirements for software self-attestation. There's a massive call out there saying it doesn't apply to open source libraries, which a bunch of people got confused by. But that's because the hammer on the other side of this is that you won't be able to sell software to the government if you don't follow these standards. That's not a very effective hammer when you're not selling it anyway and they're not paying you.
Right. I mean, there's this other idea, whether it's government or private sector, that there's such a thing as a free lunch, right? That you can take these free and open source libraries or components offered as is with no warranty and run a massive enterprise on them.
Yeah.
I think that also was where the housing bubble came in.
Right.
Do you see any of that changing in the years since we had that conversation? Do you think people are more aware now?
Yeah, I think there's the software supply chain, which is how the artifacts and source code and everything get shipped around and maintained. There's a parallel, but not quite the same liability supply chain. And I think that's what everyone is starting to pay more attention to now. If you're a vendor that's taking a bunch of open source code that has no liability associated with it, you have no vendor, you have no contractual relationship with the people that shipped it, and then you package that up into something and sell it, you're now assuming liability for everything in there, no matter where you got it from. There are vendors and other groups that are standing up to properly maintain things and be willing to assume that liability, but that's going to come with a contract. You're going to have to pay for that. And that's where the no free lunch era is kind of ending.
In some ways, that's good news. It's just interesting to me that the idea that that was ever the assumption, right? That the stuff is free as in beer and it'll be without consequence. But
there was it wasn't a major breach, but there was a breach in OpenAI last year. There was a security issue where chats could get shared between multiple users. And in their postmortem for that, they blamed it on a bug in an open source Redis client that they were using. And I think that's the shift that we have to make as an industry. You're responsible for it, even if you found it on the ground and picked it up and incorporated it into your product. You don't get to go blame the person that's doing this in volunteer time.
Do you see any efforts right now that are contributing to that era ending, that are improving the maintenance of these libraries, whether it's by their downstream consumers or upstream maintainers?
Yeah, there's a couple angles to it. One is just the government is really making the expectations clear to vendors, and this shows up in the self-attestation stuff from CISA. It shows up in the Secure Software Development Framework, the SSDF from NIST, that are really making expectations clear to vendors. A lot of folks in the open source community are scared about that because they think it might have this kind of chilling effect and scare companies out of using open source. I'm less concerned there. I think open source is so pervasive at this point that you can't get rid of it. I've never seen a customer that says, this open source code, I have to start taking liability for it. Let me go find a closed source version. I haven't seen that happen. It's not 15 or 20 years ago and there was still a bunch of FUD around open source safety. I think at this point it's there and companies are figuring out how to start dealing with it. On the flip side though, maintainers do need support and there does need to be an increase in the sustainability conversation. But those are two separate conversations in my head because they can't be fixed at the same time.
That's true. Yeah, it is a separate but related thread here to the sustainability discussion around open products rather than open source code and how vendors can succeed in businesses based on free software, especially when people take and don't give back, right?
Yeah, it's the old adage, especially with the government trying to step in now, of like, everyone's worst fear is someone showing up and saying, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help, right? There's a lot of ways they can help, but there's a lot of ways that might have unintended consequences, and we don't really know what that is yet. I'm more excited about the sustainability conversations from the business perspective and how startups and how other companies that maintain and produce this can do so in a way that no one can guarantee anything is forever, but to do so in a way where there's less fear about rug pulling or there's less fear about abandonment. If we can help educate folks on how successful business models can work in this space.
Yeah. So, what is your take on that? How do you see that, especially as the CEO of a company? How do you see that developing?
There's this old South Park episode I love to reference here called The Underwear Gnomes. And you don't have to watch it, but there's this great meme where it's like there's this sign they're holding up and it says, step 1, steal underwear. Step 2, question mark, question mark, question mark. Step 3, profit.
Right.
And I think the big thing is fill in step 2 before you go and open source something. You can't take it back. Changing licenses after is really, really hard. It's really, really disruptive. And with the funding bubble and with everything else we've seen across the whole industry, not just with open source in general, you didn't have to be as careful around business models. You see the same thing with products too. It's not really just an open source thing.
Right.
But if you're not very careful, if you don't know what your intentions are up front before you open source something, it's really easy to get yourself in a corner where you can't find a sustainable business model or anything around it. So I think in some ways, the tightening up of the economy is going to help there because it's going to force all of these issues to come front and center earlier than they would otherwise.
That is definitely, I think, a factor in the kinds of things we're seeing where companies close their doors. There's less room for error. There are some people who believe that foundations like CNCF should do more to foster that business success for open product companies. What's your take on that?
It's hard for anyone. It's hard for anyone in general to come in and kind of solve this when it's really a company-customer relationship. The CNCF is great. They provide security audits. They do all of this work in funding that can get experts and they can get people that can help. But money isn't always the answer here. Money's hard. There's no free lunch there either. Right? Even money and grants come with strings attached, and those don't always align with product roadmaps. And even just introducing money can gamify things in a way that can also hurt sustainability. One famous example there is the DigitalOcean Hacktoberfest program, where it started with this great effort to get people contributing to open source, and in return you'd get a t-shirt if you did it. That worked for the first couple of years until they found out they dramatically underestimated the amount of people that wanted t-shirts. And it led to just maintainers getting spammed with low value pull requests just for people to try to qualify for
Oh my
t-shirts.
goodness.
So all of this is hard. It all has unintended consequences that are really hard to predict upfront, and introducing money has a very complicating effect on all of it too. The efforts I find the most helpful are the ones where it's not just money, it's services, it's help that people need. Stuff like the security reviews, the security audits, getting experts that aren't necessarily on staff for every project around just to help those maintainers and help in a consulting fashion go a long way.
And I've talked to one other person from a now erstwhile company who said that there should be more that specifically CNCF does to connect users of open source projects with their associated vendors in terms of promotion, publicity, that kind of thing. I know that there's also an aversion within CNCF to picking winners, so to speak. What's your view on that idea?
It's one of those other weird things in the open source community and in the developer community in general, that if you start charging for things, if you introduce money to it, then they get grossed out and they only want people that are doing things for free and doing things out of the best interest of their heart. But that doesn't work either long term. So it's a tough needle to thread, but I applaud any efforts to help companies build sustainable business models.
And there's also the whole license discussion within the open product world. Things like the delayed open source or functional source, business source license. If you don't have a rug pull where you change in midstream, do you think that those are viable ways for businesses to, from the start, fill in that number 2 on the list?
It's early, right? I'm somewhat skeptical of those. I call them open source light or fake open source licenses. The main criticism that I've seen, the main one I agree with, is open source has built an incredible brand. And what really matters in that brand is lawyers. What's happened in the last decade, I think, is that lawyers have finally understood these licenses and they're now comfortable using them because there's only a handful that are in common use and they understand them. And that's how, as a developer at a large company, there's typically a policy that says you're allowed to use anything with these licenses. And they all get incorporated into this big dependency graph. And if you're using one package, it probably has 1,000 dependencies inside of it that also have those licenses. And that's why you don't need to have a lawyer review every new package you import, because we've all agreed that those are okay. These other ones that are trying to draft on that brand and say, hey, we're open source too, except for this one thing. I think it's somewhat short-sighted, because as soon as some of those packages start making their way into this dependency graph, the lawyers are going to come back. And nobody wants the lawyers to come back and have to start reviewing these things. Even if you're in this local area where it applies to everyone, anyone's allowed to use this except for one company. That's fine in the short term. That's fine maybe for you. But as soon as that starts getting spread and you have, say, 50 packages in this 1,000 dependency graph, at some point you are going to be affected by something in there, and it's really going to deteriorate and diminish the meaning and comfort of people using open source. So I'm fine with those licenses. I'm fine with people doing what they need to, but I really dislike the conflation and trying to claim that they are open source or they're as good or they're as easy to use as open source.
You have kind of this dual view, right? You're very active with the OpenSSF and with Sigstore, but also running Chainguard. So what's worked for Chainguard in terms of that business model component?
We build and package and help maintain and ship and distribute and fix vulnerabilities and all of that in a huge set of open source code and make that available to our users. For the most part, it's not even originated from us, the code that we're building and helping fix and helping distribute. It's other open source packages that people want to distribute. And so we've been pretty careful and thoughtful up front about exactly how we're setting up these tiers. And there's actually a pretty big separation between stuff that we give away for free and stuff that is open source. We have products that happen to have a free tier. That's not the same as open source. And we've kind of kept those pretty distinct and tried to make that as clear as we can. So we went in with a business model in mind. We'll have to keep iterating. We'll have to change that. Business is hard. Things change over time.
Yeah.
But the licenses we see as very, very hard to change long term.
Okay. Is there anything that you think people that might listen to this should know about open source and open sustainability that they don't know today?
The overall interaction between legal and procurement teams at big companies and open source, I think, is somewhat underestimated and undervalued by the industry today. We still see it show up sometimes in vendor procurement questionnaires asking us to certify that there's no open source and there's no copy left in there. When our whole business model is providing open source and copy left. And there's a big disconnect between those teams and the engineering teams that are still actually doing things. It's gotten better over time because people do get more comfortable with it. But I think there's still a large gap there in understanding of what these licenses actually mean. GitHub has come a long way in helping recommend great licenses to people as they set up projects and helping try to explain them, but no one reads these things.
It's true. Anything I haven't thought to ask you about you wanted to mention?
I think there's no free lunch thing is really the biggest. Even if the source code is free, unless you're prepared to patch and update and manage and deal with incidents and deal with vulnerabilities and all of that, just because you got the source code doesn't mean you're getting things for free. You have to have a plan for dealing with all of that. The plan can be just hope the community keeps doing it, and that's where stuff like the CNCF comes in because they do have such a large active community around this set of projects. But even then, we see that there's still no guarantee that these things are going to be maintained forever. So as you adopt things, be more conscious about it. Make sure you know what you're adopting. Make sure you know that it's sustainably developed or not, and have a plan for what to do in case the maintenance does slow down or isn't up to the standard you have. And that plan can't be just file angry GitHub issues and yell at the maintainers.
We can definitely leave it there. That's a great place to leave off. And really appreciate your insights as always, Dan. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 1, Text Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariseau, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I-S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about open source principles and sustainability. Thank you for being with us so far.